I have said this, I don't know how many times before, but the left is really, really bad when it comes to foreign policy, or at least they're okay in certain areas, like Israel, Palestine. Although I have my criticisms of some of the things that are said, and especially in and around it. But that's maybe a video for another time. But foreign policy as a whole of the left is honestly quite a blind spot. There are really not a lot, shall we say, of lefty experts uh, who would sort of say that foreign policy is their thing. It's not something you tend to see. It is a massive blind spot that happens, and most of it, unfortunately, is really driven by this idea that if America does anything, then oh, it must be bad, regardless of what America is doing. Oh, clearly must be bad. We saw this, of course, kick off in Ukraine, and it would be very, very, very interesting to actually see if the whole Israel Palestine thing hadn't happened, what they would be sort of focusing on now at this moment in that conflict. Because everyone who was like really concerned about that conflict and all the things that they used to say, the second the Israel Palestine conflict, that conflict's been, the Ukraine conflict's been pretty much forgotten and barely even mentioned by these channels who used to talk about it like all the time. Now only focus on that, and I understand, of course, in that regard. But hey, that is a conflict that is still ongoing. There is, of course, a lot of really bad evidence coming out recently about what's going on in the Ukraine conflict. Like we've just had confirmation, for example, that Russia has been using chemical weapons over there. It's just not any of like the bad stuff, or at least the bad stuff yet, but they're using sort of tear gas grenades in that. And of course, that counts as a chemical weapon. So there are, you know, big problems over there. And I think it is an issue where you sort of focus on one thing and then you sort of play magpie sort of politics. You sort of leave that by the wayside. You sort of forget about that and fly off to the new, shiny thing. But today, I really want to talk about something that David Lammy has written. He wrote a piece in The Guardian talking about what Labour's foreign policy is going to be. That it is going to be based on sort of a realistic approach to us as what we are as a nation, not sort of glorifying the past about what we used to be, which, to be honest, is the exact direction we really need to be going in, sort of as a country. We need to be looking at sort of what we are now as a nation, sort of what we can achieve, what we can do, and what we can add as a partner in many sort of global situations, while not necessarily taking the lead, but being able to sort of form coalitions, form sort of responses. So that is something I think is going to be kind of interesting to see how this sort of Labour foreign policy does develop over time, and what we will see from sort of what we are seeing sort of Lammy now to maybe sort of, I don't know, what 2020, what 2030, to sort of how that policy develops over time. So this is going to be quite interesting to see how this develops and where we go in these sort of different directions, and what this ultimately will mean for the UK being sort of its relations to other sort of foreign countries, and which direction we will go. Ultimately, I think this will certainly lead us to a more close relationship with the EU. So absolutely, certainly, I think a very much given, the way that the stuff that Lammy's talking about. But like I say, we'll get into this in a moment. But before we do get into that, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page, the one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee, the YouTube thank you button, and of course, as always, thank you very much to all those people who do help and support the channel. So off we go over to David Lammy, writing in The Guardian, with the title of Labour's Foreign Policy will be a realistic about us as a nation, not nostalgic about what we used to be. And I have to say, that as a sort of premise is a good direction. It's something that has been very, very, very much needed, honestly, as an approach to sort of where our foreign policy should be. We've seen many examples over the past since 2016 about that. So let's start what he says. So Every time you look at social media, a new international crisis is unfolding. Drones from Iran and one of its proxies now hurtling towards Israel. And another Israeli strikes kills civilians in Gaza. A Ukrainian city faces a new fresh wave of attacks from Putin's war machine. The revelation of another cyber attack from a hostile state on UK soil. Another threat of a land grab in my ancestral home of Guyana. Another coup in another coup in the Seychelles. A new flood, a wildfire, a hurricane, the latest manifestation of the climate emergency that is too often treated as an afterthought. And he's right. This is one of the things that I think puts a lot of people, and especially off, when it comes to sort of looking at foreign policy. A lot of stuff can happen. When I do Geoscope with Graham, it can be almost, and I do get a lot of people that have said it in the chat, oh, it feels very sort of doom and gloom. And sometimes when you look at foreign policy, that can be the unfortunate state of play when it comes to it. When you're looking at sort of news around the world, very often it is it is a lot of bad news, unfortunately. But that is just the state of things when you look at sort of foreign policy, and when you look at sort of how this is going to sort of affect things. So I do often try to sort of look for like a good or a funny sort of news story from time to time, sort of make sure that it's not all doom and gloom, but it can be incredibly difficult. That anyway continues. So the world order, which once appeared very governed, is at least to a large extent, by the rules that we helped to set up with our allies after the Second World War, is now defined by a new form of geopolitical competition between the United States and China over microchips, military might, and trade. Between countries defined by the CI director William Burns as hedging the middle, setting their own agendas in Africa, Asia, Latin America, between friends and rivals alike over the green transition, on which the future of humanity depends. Again, not wrong. That is going to be easily one of the biggest challenges that we see facing, the relationship and the geopolitical sort of tensions that are going to come from China and the United States competing over all of these new different things. Microchips, vastly important. At the moment, every single microchip pretty much comes from Taiwan. If China really does invade Taiwan, that is going to cause a huge problem for those microchips. That's why we have seen a lot of other countries make a lot of investments into this to make sure that is now sort of spread out, that we aren't entirely dependent on Taiwan, because I think it's something incredibly big. Like, I think it's like 70 to 80% of all microchips come from Taiwan, which is a lot of stuff to do. Military might, another issue that is going to sort of cause tension between China and the United States, something that does need to be sought out. We've seen China really push into places, sort of challenging sort of territorial waters, sort of challenging sort of the right to sort of free trade on the seas, and sort of the right of navigation, as we call it. So that is something that is going to be sort of big as well. And we are seeing other countries come into play. Africa in particular, we have seen very recently, Russia has sent over its Africa Corps, or what used to be the Wagner sort of military group. They're now calling it the Africa Corps, sending troops and mercenaries over there to try and affect change, to try and get these countries on side so that they can have more access and fairer, well, I say fairer, a bigger policy, a bigger sort of push to get their resources. But we've seen over time what Wagner has done by committing war crimes, just seizing resources. All these stuff is not going to sort of very much help these countries. But if you are, well, want to make sure that you don't get cooed, it's always good to, so shall I say, have a mercenary company in your back pocket that you can sort of rely on should something like that happen. And it's the same we are seeing in some of these other countries of trying to sort of compete for influence on this. The green transition is something that is going to be very, very big over the next couple of years. I've said this before, that Rishi Sunak completely trashing, and Boris Johnson as well, trashing the green agenda, the investment in all of this. I think it's something that Labour should really, really look into and make sure that this is done, because if we do not, we could fall very, very much behind. And doing that is going to take a lot more money and a lot more catching up then unfortunately we may need, and it will be a very, very much damaging to us as a country if we are lagging very much behind. Unfortunately, because of Rishi Sunak, we are, unfortunately. But there you go. So, within this very messy and multipolar world, Britain is still reeling from 14 years of Conservative government. Our economy is now held back by recession. Our army now has fewer soldiers at any time since Napoleon. Public services are on their knees. The international relationships have now been undermined by the reckless and gaffe-prone diplomacy of Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and Rishi Sunak, and their damaging indifference to the rule of law. So, obviously, something Lammy doesn't really mention here is Brexit. And this is one of the strategies you are seeing. Don't mention the B word. But in the next parliament, I think you're going to see it. And very recently, I think it is entirely possible you might see maybe some sort of Labour revolt or the next parliament to say, hey, we've actually got to start talking about Brexit. Like it or not, we've got to start talking about it. You cannot have a serious conversation about the UK economy unless you are sort of willing to acknowledge Brexit has done damage to it in very, very deep and meaningful ways. So you've got to be able to sort of talk about Brexit. I think we're going to see that in the next parliament in some way. Fewer soldiers, of course, this has been very, very much undercut by austerity. And I think this is almost the very strange, driftless direction almost that this has taken. I mean, you had the whole integrated review of the like the UK needed this fast sort of reaction army that can be deployed around the world. That's not necessarily sort of what we really need as a country anymore. We can have a very, very good sort of army with what we have, but we just have to sort of be realistic about it. We're not going to be, sending, stuff beyond sort of into the Asia Pacific, as it said in the integrated review, and sort of even infamously said the age of the grand tank battles is over, massively undermined once again our own tank development in that area. Of course, the war in Ukraine changed all of that again. So there is a intimate need, I think, to really, really look at what the future of the UK armed forces is. And that does sort of very much come under the sort of more defense rather than foreign policy, but does play, some sort of role. Public services, they're not really a foreign policy area, but I will agree with David Lammy on that. And of course, he is absolutely right. International relations have been massively undermined by Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and Rishi Sunak. So this is something that does really need to be reaffirmed, especially with the light of changing government. So that ultimately we will see with someone like David Lammy coming in. So that is at least something that can be repaired, but it will take time to do. So he continues, we should not be pessimists. Britain still has great strengths and enormous potential, and he is right about that. We do have a lot of good strengths. I've said before, we are very good in a lot of the cultural areas. There's a lot of good stuff in the green tech and HS and green technologies. We actually are still quite good at, but they need investing in. Which again, huge potential there for us. There's a lot of stuff you can talk about, but I've already been sidetracked a lot of that stuff. So, but he is right that we are and do have a lot of strengths that we should play to. And I think that's what hopefully we will see. So he continues, with the right leadership, we can and will navigate this new era, and we will remain a permanent member of the UN Security Council. We have the sixth largest economy in the world. Our universities, legal sectors, creatives, businesses, and continue to be world leaders. Again, he's not wrong. I know that sort of language has obviously bad connotations with Boris Johnson, but he's not wrong in those regards to some of those stuff. And I think it is making sure that we do sort of keep that and we do invest in that area. But hey, we're getting off sidetracked off here. We're talking about, of course, foreign policy. So our diplomats are admired by our friends as well as our rivals, but in this newly and dangerous divided era, Britain needs to refresh its approach to foreign policy. Again, it's absolutely, definitely needs that. So Labour's approach is to reconnect Britain. Absolutely agree with that. So, for our security and prosperity at home, we will build on a progressive realism. Again, couldn't agree more. It starts by taking the best of twos Labour's greatest former secretaries, the realist form of Ernest Bevin, who was part of Clement Attlee's post-war Labour government, helped create NATO and Britain's place within it, alongside the independent nuclear deterrent, and the progressivism of Robin Cook, whose ethical dimension brought climate action and human rights into the diplomatic mainstream. He's not wrong with that. Robin Cook did a lot to introduce those into the economic mainstream. So he is not wrong, and it will be good to see that be brought back in many ways. So progressive realism says we must use realist means to pursue progressive ends instead of using realism for transactional purposes and the accumulation of power. We want to use it in service of a progressive goals. Again, couldn't agree more. This is all going really good in the direction I want to see more of in foreign policy. So, what do you want to do? Counter climate change. Excellent. Defending democracy, advancing economic growth, and tackling inequality abroad as well as at home. Excellent. That's really good. Now we just have to start to see what that is really going to be, and we're not really going to see that until we see Lammy sort of in power. So, in the pursuit of ideals without delusions about what is achievable, when it comes with the recognition that the UK's interests must be defended for us to be a force for good. So, what is progressive realism in practice? So, it means recognizing that the UK's success depends on hard-headed realism about our own nation and the continent's security, not be nostalgic misremembering of what we used to be. Ken couldn't agree more on that front. It means recognizing that supporting Ukraine is not only a moral imperative, but a strategic necessity, and that Russia under Putin is a long term generational threat that requires a long term generational response. Yes. Yes. Absolutely. I am so glad he has said that. That is Yes, absolutely. I'm so glad that he's sort of said that in response to that. Now, of course, we'll see what Lammy does when he's in power and what that means. Maybe we'll get more about this, maybe in the manifesto, what he tends to do on this. But that right there, good rhetoric. Now the rhetoric needs to be connected with good sort of policy proposals and what sort of Lammy intends to do to follow through on that. Anyway, he continues. So this is why Labour is proposing a new geopolitical partnership with the EU. From our position outside the single market and customs union, our proposal for a new UK EU security pact will be designed to increase our economic, climate, and national security. Again, not a bad idea. We'll see sort of when the EU sort of responds, but they're not really going to respond until at least he's in power. And this is why, of course, Keir Starmer committed last week to raise defence spending to 2.5% as soon as resources allow and make an absolute generational commitment to nuclear deterrence. And, well, we've seen that why countries now are looking at nuclear deterrent. We've seen countries ask if Trump were to sort of, well, get in and remove nuclear weapons, could sort of the UK and France being sort of the two biggest sort of next to Russia, uh, nuclear powers, could we extend our nuclear umbrella to sort of the rest of Europe? That's not necessarily a bad idea. It's something that we could absolutely do and see UK and France, if we do have that security pact, work together to achieve. So, in the face of conflict in the Middle East in the short term, we need urgently an immediate ceasefire complied with by both sides, an immediate return of all the hostages cruelly held by Hamas terrorists, and for Israel to lift the unacceptable restrictions on the flow of aid to enable a mass surge of supplies into Gaza. Again, couldn't agree more. In the medium term, progressive realism means seeking the same things for Ukraine, Israel, and Palestine, for each to be a sovereign, secure, international recognized state at peace with its neighbors. Couldn't agree more with that as well. This is why the next Labour government will be committed to working with international partners to recognise Palestine as a state and its contribution to securing a negotiated two-state solution. Absolutely, that's what we want. That's what we want to see, and that's what we want to see happen. So I'm very glad for you sort of saying that. Progressive realism means recognizing that the climate emergency is the defining challenge of the next century, which requires diplomatic innovations. As such, Labour has now proposed a clean power alliance to counter it. But also, that represents a unique opportunity to drive jobs, growth, and innovation backed by real industrial strategy. Holy moly, just saying that industrial strategy is going to be, oh, you have no idea how good it is and how big that change that is going to be just to have an industrial strategy. Like, we are going to sort of go in this direction. This is what we're going to do as an industrial strategy. Holy moly, just having that is going to be good, because right now the UK has no industrial strategy, doesn't know what it wants to do. And that is because of Conservatives just not understanding um why why we need one. They just think, oh well, we'll just leave it to businesses and then they'll do their thing. But you've got businesses going, okay, well, government, what do you want us to do? Is there going to be sort of investment things? Is there going to be stuff that we can have? Should we invest in this? Who knows? They want, the government to sort of say something, and yet the government says nothing. So having that is going to be really good. Really good. But anyway, back to it. And of course, I do like the idea of a clean power alliance. That is something that could actually be quite successful. And of course, countries working together on these technologies. Maybe sort of go, hey, we're sort of really good at like offshore wind power stuff. Maybe those countries that could have wind power stuff all get together and say, right, let's find out how we can improve this technology and make it more better. That will be something very, very good to see. So hey, we'll see how that sort of unfolds and what that actually means as a clean power alliance. But I like the sound of it so far. So progressive realism is not only just defined by the policies we espouse, but also by the approach we will take to it. Also take to diplomacy. Again, absolutely true. So I'm really glad that he is saying that. So honestly, at the moment, it does look like Lammy is going to be a very, very good foreign secretary. Of course, he's going to have to deliver, and we'll see, how he will deliver on that. So let's finish this off. So we must shake hands with those that we need for peace. Progressives must not be uncompromising about working with our partners in the Gulf. But we also must recognize that partnerships with the so-called global South will work better than lectures and that hypocrisy, be that about sharing COVID vaccines or by obeying international law, is corrosive to foreign policy. We should not fail to recognize that the US will remain the UK's most essential ally, whoever occupies the White House. And I like that, hedging his bets. I like that. But there you go. Of course, if Trump does get in the White House, those relations going to be uh, afraid, if not put to the test. Well, but of course, again, we hope, Trump doesn't win. Um, and of course, pursuing those ideas will be futile without first guaranteeing our own security. It relies on knowing that progressive policy without realism is anti-idealism, just as realism without a sense of progress can become cynical and very tactical. It is rooted in the optimism that when progressives act realistically and practically, they can change the world. Holy moly. Um, God, I would love to speak to David Lammy. I would love, I would love to speak to David Lammy. He's gone from middling to sort of very much top of the list of people who I would love to speak to. Holy moly. Um, yeah, I would love to speak to David Lammy. It's not going to happen, of course, but talk about a big get if I ever got a chance to speak to him. Yeah, holy moly, that is amazing. I like it. Now, of course, he's got to put it into practice, and of course, with him and being in power, we're going to see how that all plays out. Like I say, we will be obviously looking at what Lammy does when he is eventually in power. By the looks of it, they are going to be. So, hey, we'll see what this happens. But hey, let me know what you think about what Lammy has said here. I think there's a lot of potential and a lot of possibility, and I think going in this direction of sort of recognizing that we need to be realistic about what Britain can and can't do. We need to sort of play to our strengths, while also sort of working with allies to make, shore up weaknesses. I think the whole idea of a sort of a clean energy alliance is not necessarily a bad idea. Maybe it can finally do something against OPEC. We'll see. But we'll see what happens. There's a lot of stuff, very stuff, interesting stuff that's said there. But of course, Lammy is right. We not only need to have sort of rhetoric, we need to sort of look at the purpose and the direction that we're going to go. And so far, the rhetoric is spot on. It's the right stuff I have wanted to sort of hear and see from someone who wants to be sort of always he's going to be the foreign secretary. Now we just have to see what the policy is going to be, how that sort of comes into play, and of course how that is sort of used on the sort of the world stage. So a lot of good stuff there. A lot of very good stuff. So we'll see what happens. But as always, we'll see you all next time.